The desert sun turned metal into weapons and air into something you could taste. Sloane Merrick lay flat against rock that had been baking since dawn, her left shoulder screaming where shrapnel had torn through muscle and uniform alike. Blood seeped dark against tan fabric, spreading in a pattern she'd been trained to recognize as critical. But her hands didn't shake. They never shook. She pressed a tourniquet against Dalton Cross's thigh with one hand, while the other kept pressure on Knox Porter's chest seal. 225 pounds of unconscious seal in front of her, bleeding out faster than the mathematics of survival should allow. Porter coughing blood in wet, labored gasps that said his lung was trying to collapse again, and bullets still chewing up the rocks around them. "Chief," her voice cut through the chaos without rising to a shout. Projection, not panic. "Dalton needs evac now, femoral artery compromised. He's got maybe 4 minutes before class 4 shock." Somewhere behind the inadequate cover of a boulder, Chief Garrett Wade was still returning fire, still buying them seconds they shouldn't have, still refusing to accept that this morning's training exercise had become something else entirely. The kind of something that turned living men into statistics. Sloane twisted the tourniquet's windlass one more rotation. Dalton's arterial spray finally stopped. His face had gone the color of desert stone, but his chest still rose and fell. Still breathing meant still fighting. Still fighting meant she hadn't lost him yet. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to check her own wound. Shoulder torn open, muscle damage, blood loss significant, but not immediately fatal. The kind of injury that would end most people's day. Most people had the luxury of stopping. "Nobody dies today," she whispered to the men bleeding out around her, a promise she'd made before, a promise she intended to keep, even if it killed her. The Blackhawks' rotors were a prayer in the distance, growing louder, getting closer. Not close enough, never close enough. 68 hours earlier, the supply truck kicked up dust that settled on everything. Uniforms, equipment, skin hope. Fort Irwin sat in the Mojave like humanity's argument against the desert, and the desert was winning. Prefab buildings that looked temporary because they were. Guard towers that leaned at angles suggesting they'd given up pretending to be permanent. Air thick with diesel exhaust in the particular kind of heat that made you forget what cool felt like. Sloane climbed down from the truck bed with her aid bag, already cutting familiar grooves into her shoulder. 28 years old, 5'4" in boots, 118 pounds soaking wet. Lean in the way people got when they'd learned to make do with less, to be more with less. Her uniform had seen enough field time to know what it was for. Every strap tight, every pouch positioned exactly where muscle memory could find it in the dark, in the chaos. In those moments when thinking took too long, an instinct had to be enough. The SEALs lounging near the armory gave her the look. She knew the look. Had seen it in a dozen different bases, 100 different faces. Not hostile exactly. Just the professional skepticism of men who'd learned that the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time could get everyone killed. 6 of them burned dark by sun and wind until the creases around their eyes had become permanent. Weapons hanging from their bodies like they'd grown there. Gear arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of ritual, of superstition, of men who'd survived long enough to know that luck was just preparation that hadn't been tested yet. Dalton Cross noticed her first, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested he'd been lifting more than weights, arms thick with the kind of muscle you couldn't fake in a gym. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. "Outstanding." The word dripped with everything it didn't say. "They sent us a medic." He spat into the dirt. The gesture wasn't meant for her personally, just for the situation, for the universe's sense of humor. "What are we supposed to do? Ask the bad guys to form an orderly line for Band-Aids." Knox Porter shook his head, grinning at his own joke before he made it. Quieter than Cross, but cut from the same cloth. The kind of quiet that spoke of thinking before acting, of measuring twice and cutting once. "Doc, no offense, but this isn't sick call. We move fast, we move hard, and we don't stop for people who can't keep up." The laughter rippled through the group. Not mean exactly, but sharp enough to draw lines in the sand. Lines that said she was outside their circle, and they wanted her to know it. Wanted her to understand the rules before someone got hurt trying to change them. Sloane didn't argue. She dropped her ruck, unzipped her aid bag, and began checking her kit with the kind of methodical precision that turned inspection into meditation. Combat gauze counted and recounted. Tourniquets tested for tension, checking that the windlass mechanisms hadn't seized in storage. Chest seals examined for tears in the packaging that would render them useless the moment they were needed most. Her fingers moved automatically. Muscle memory from too many pre-mission inspections, where the difference between thorough and close enough was measured in heartbeats that would never beat again. Beckett Hayes leaned against his rifle, younger than the others, 23, and still trying to prove he belonged, still trying to earn the right to stop trying so hard. You really think all that's going to help when things get loud? Sloane glanced up once, briefly, her eyes taking in details the others missed because they weren't looking for them. The sweat stains on Hayes's uniform that said he wasn't drinking enough water in this heat. The way Cross kept shifting his weight off his left foot, favoring it in a way that suggested an old injury acting up. The frayed radio antenna on Chief Wade's vest that meant communication problems nobody had mentioned in briefing. Small things. The kind of small things that became big things when everything went wrong at once. When you're choking on your own blood, she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough, it'll help plenty. The grin faded from Hayes's face like someone had turned off a light. The easy laughter died in the heat. Sloane went back to her kit fingers, moving through supplies with the same calm efficiency she'd shown since stepping off the truck. No bravado, no challenges thrown back. Just a professional doing her job while others decided whether that job mattered. Chief Garrett Wade stood apart from his men watching, 42 years old with the weight of command written in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his mouth. He'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between someone playing at being ready and someone who actually was. He saw the way her hands never hesitated as she packed her kit. The way she'd assessed his team in that single glance, cataloging problems they hadn't told her about, hadn't even admitted to themselves. The way she'd handled Hayes' skepticism without making the kid feel foolish, even though he'd been mocking her 30 seconds earlier. Wade had lost a medic once, Elena Rodriguez. Good at her job, fast under pressure, died anyway, because being good and being fast sometimes wasn't enough when the universe decided it was your turn. He'd sworn after Elena that he wouldn't get attached to the next one, wouldn't make the mistake of thinking that competence could stand in for luck when luck ran out. But he was watching this one anyway. Couldn't help it. Something in the way she moved suggested she understood that her job was keeping people alive in a world specifically designed to kill them. And she decided that was acceptable odds. The patrol stepped off at dawn when the heat was still negotiating with the shadows. 12 men moving in staggered column rifles up eyes scanning terrain that had been trying to kill people since before there were people to kill. The mission was simple on paper, the kind of simple that experienced operators knew meant complicated in practice. 48-hour field training exercise in Restricted Zone 12, where the ridgelines jutted against the sky like broken teeth and the ground beneath your boots was unforgiving. Mock HVT rescue, simulated enemy contact. All the fun of combat without the actual dying, in theory. Sloane kept position in the middle of the column where Wade had ordered her, her aid bag a familiar weight against her back. She didn't complain about the pace, didn't ask for water breaks or adjustments to the route. Her eyes moved constantly, not just watching for threats the way infantry did, but cataloging the small details that could matter later. The way Cross favored his left leg on uneven ground. The shallow breathing that said Hayes was pushing too hard too early, burning energy he'd need later. The tension in Wade's shoulders that meant he was seeing something on the ridgelines he didn't like, but couldn't quite identify. 2 hours in the temperature climbed past 110. The kind of heat that stopped being a number and started being a presence. A third party in every decision. Cross drained his canteen in 3 long pulls. Sloane watched him do it and felt something tighten in her chest. Professional concern, clinical and immediate. Might want to pace that water, she said quietly, pulling an electrolyte packet from her vest. We've got hours left in this heat and your body's already behind on hydration. Cross turned with irritation already written across his sunburned face. Don't worry about me, Doc. Worry about keeping up. Porter chimed in from a few meters ahead. Yeah, save the bedside manner for the aid station. More chuckles from the team. Wade didn't intervene. He was focused on his map, trying to raise command on a radio that was giving him nothing but white noise in return. The frayed antenna she'd noticed earlier was doing exactly what frayed antennas did, failing when you needed them most. Sloane said nothing else. She mixed her electrolyte powder with water from her own canteen and drank it slowly, methodically, while her eyes continued their constant sweep of the terrain around them. Watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when professional skepticism would have to make room for professional respect, or professional necessity, whichever came first. 20 minutes later, Cross stumbled. It was barely noticeable. A slight weave in his step, a hand that reached out to steady himself against a rock he didn't quite need for balance. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Sloane was looking for it, had been looking for it since he'd drained that canteen like water was infinite and consequences were optional. Chief, she called quietly to Wade, respectful of the chain of command, but firm in her professional assessment. "We need to take 5. Wade turned, irritation flashing across his face before he could quite control it. "We're not even 2 clicks out." Cross is showing early heat casualty symptoms. Her voice stayed level, clinical, the tone of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. "Muscle fatigue, mild disorientation, compromised decision-making. Push him much further without intervention, and you'll be carrying him. Or leaving him." "I'm fine," Cross protested, but his voice came out slightly slurred. Just enough to prove he wasn't. Sloan ignored him, addressing Wade directly. 5 minutes. Get some electrolytes in him, check his core temperature, let his cardiovascular system stabilize, or lose him for the rest of the mission. "Your call, Chief." Wade studied Cross more closely, noting the flush in his face that wasn't just sunburn, the way he was breathing through his mouth, the slight tremor in his hands that meant his body was starting to shut down non-essential systems to preserve core function. All the signs Sloan had seen 10 minutes ago. After a moment that felt longer than it was, Wade nodded grimly. 5 minutes. Hydrate and check gear." Cross sat in the shade of a boulder, sipping the electrolyte solution Sloan prepared for him with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Measured amounts, specific timing. Nothing left to chance when chance was the thing trying to kill you. His color gradually returned to something approximating normal. The slight tremor in his hands faded like it had never been there. Sloan knelt beside him, checking his pulse, his pupil. Response: the capillary refill in his nail beds. All the small indicators that separated recovering from declining. "Feel better?" she asked. He nodded reluctantly, pride warring with gratitude and losing. "Yeah, thanks." Porter shook his head in something that might have been amazement. "How did you spot that?" "He looked fine to me." "Training," Sloan said simply, "and experience." What she didn't say was that she'd seen heat casualties before war, had seen what happened when you didn't catch them early, had held dying men whose bodies had cooked from the inside out while their brains swelled against their skulls and their organs shut down one by one. Had promised herself she'd never let it happen again if she could help it. Some promises you kept because they were easy, others you kept because the alternative was unacceptable. When they resumed the patrol 15 minutes later, Cross's step was steady and sure. His breathing regulated, his hands stable on his weapon. But more importantly, the attitude of the team had shifted. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but shifted nonetheless. They still didn't trust her completely. Trust was something you earned in fire, not in shade. But they'd seen her catch something they'd missed, something that could have compromised the mission and endangered lives. And in their world, that was how you started earning the right to be trusted. The valley narrowed as they moved deeper into restricted terrain. Ridgelines rising on both sides like walls closing in, like jaws preparing to bite. It was textbook ambush terrain, the kind that showed up in training manuals with helpful diagrams and calm explanations that never quite captured what it felt like to walk into a kill zone with your eyes open. Limited escape routes, natural cover for attackers, clear fields of fire down onto anyone stupid enough or unlucky enough to walk the low ground. Hayes muttered under his breath, "Something doesn't feel right." "Nothing feels right out here," Wade replied, but his hand tightened on his rifle. His eyes scanned the ridgelines with increased intensity, looking for the glint of metal, the shadow that didn't belong, the shape that was too regular to be natural. Finding nothing, which somehow felt worse than finding something. Sloan's attention was divided between the tactical situation and the medical one, watching the terrain the way Wade did, but also watching her team. Hayes' elevated heart rate visible in the pulse at his throat. Porter checking his weapon more frequently than necessary, the gesture revealing anxiety he wouldn't voice. Cross moving better now, but still favoring that left leg in ways that would matter if they had to run. Everything was information. Everything was data. Everything could be the detail that made the difference when differences meant life or death. They reached the target site just after noon when the sun had turned the air into something visible. Shimmering heat that distorted distance and made judgment difficult. Wade raised his fist and the column halted. He scanned the ridgelines through his optics, searching for the Opfer Marines who should be playing enemy today. Searching for the training scenario they'd been briefed on. Finding nothing. The valley seemed empty. Too empty. Sloan felt it before she could articulate it, a wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with temperature or terrain. The kind of wrongness that came from pattern recognition developed over years of paying attention to things that didn't fit. "Chief," she said quietly, "bird patterns are wrong." Wade glanced at her, distracted by his radio's continued failure to raise command. "What, the birds?" She gestured at the sky. "At the rocks. at the spaces between. There should be ravens, hawks, something, but there's nothing, like something scared them off. It's just Desert Doc. No, Chief. Her voice was still quiet, but carried a new edge. Professional concern giving way to professional alarm. This is perfect ambush terrain. No wildlife, no radio contact, and we're walking right into... The first shot cracked across the rocks like the world splitting open. Not the pop of a training round, not the blank fire simulation of combat. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a live round passing close enough to hear its wake. It kicked up dust 2 inches from Hayes' boots. The kid froze brain trying to process what his ears were telling him against what his expectations demanded. Before anyone could shout a warning, the second report boomed across the valley. An RPG, real, live, incoming. It screamed in from the eastern ridge, trailing fire and physics and the promise of everything about to go wrong at once. Slammed into the far bank with a sound like God's hammer hitting God's anvil, showering them with gravel and fire, and the kind of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Contact, Wade's voice cut through the ringing in everyone's ears. Professional. Controlled. Doing the job even as the job tried to kill him. Real contact, take cover. The ambush erupted from 3 directions at once. Automatic weapons fire raked the riverbed from positions the SEALs couldn't even see yet. Muzzle flashes winking from shadows in the rocks. Bullets snapping overhead, cracking off stone, filling the air with the whine of ricochets and the scream of near misses. The SEALs scattered professional training, taking over where conscious thought had surrendered to survival instinct, finding whatever cover they could. Boulders, depressions in the ground, anything that might stop a bullet or at least make the shooters work harder. But they were caught in the open, silhouetted against light-colored rock, while their enemy fired from concealed positions that had been chosen with care and malice and an understanding of exactly how to turn geography into a weapon. Sloan hit the ground hard behind a chunk of broken concrete that had probably been part of something once, but was just cover now. Her aid bag slammed into her ribs, driving the breath from her lungs in a rush that tasted of dust and copper. She pressed herself flat against stone while bullets chewed the air above her head, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to understand exactly how thin the line was between alive and dead. That's when the screaming started. Dalton Cross spun backward like he'd been hit by an invisible baseball bat, his leg erupting in a spray of blood and torn fabric that painted the gravel beneath him in shades of red that shouldn't exist outside a body. He went down hard already, clutching at his thigh where something vital had torn open and was emptying him onto the desert floor. Knox Porter took the next round. It punched through his vest at an angle that suggested luck had run out and physics had taken over. Spun him against the rocks, sliding down the stone face and leaving a red smear that marked his passage. His breathing harsh and wet in a way that said the bullet had found something important. Beckett Hayes caught shrapnel from another RPG. The blast picked him up and slammed him down like a discarded toy, leaving him rolling onto his side with one arm hanging useless and blood running between his fingers as he pressed them against a wound that was larger than his hand. 3 men down. 3 men bleeding. 3 men dying. And Sloane's mind shifted into a different gear entirely. The chaos around her, the gunfire, the explosions, the shouts of the remaining SEALs faded into background noise. Her vision narrowed, focused, cataloging details with surgical precision. Cross-arterial bleeding. Femoral artery compromise based on spray pattern and volume. Blood loss rapid and accelerating. Tourniquet required immediately or unconsciousness in 90 seconds. Death in 4 to 6 minutes. Porter sucking chest wound. Possible pneumothorax based on breathing sounds and chest movement asymmetry. Labored breathing indicating lung collapse. Chest seal needed within 2 minutes to prevent respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. Hayes severe laceration to upper arm and shoulder. Possible radial artery involvement based on bleeding pattern. Signs of shock setting in pale skin, rapid shallow breathing, decreased responsiveness. Pressure dressing and IV fluids required but not immediately life-threatening if bleeding controlled. 3 men, 3 different medical emergencies, all critical, all requiring immediate intervention. The textbook said to triage, save who you could, accept losses where necessary, choose the most salvageable, and let the others go. Sloan Merrick had never been good at following textbooks. Not when they told her some people had to die because saving everyone was mathematically impossible. She'd learned her trade from a father who'd believed that impossible just meant you hadn't tried hard enough yet, who'd spent 20 years as an Army combat medic proving that mathematics didn't account for stubborn refusal to quit. Sergeant First Class Nathan Merrick had died in deployment when Sloan was 19. Died doing exactly what he'd taught her to do, refusing to accept that some wounds were fatal until they actually were. Multiple casualties. Wade's voice cut through the gunfire, shouting into a radio that still gave him nothing but static. Command, this is Alpha. We are taking effective fire and have wounded. Nothing, he tried again, voice tight with frustration in the beginning of fear. The kind of fear that came from understanding your options were narrowing and none of them were good. Command, this is Alpha. 3 urgent surgical. Request immediate medevac. Static, white noise. The sound of being on your own when you couldn't afford to be. Sloan looked at the 3 men bleeding out on the gravel. Looked at the SEALs still in the fight, pressed flat behind inadequate cover, while enemy fire poured down from the heights. Looked at the mathematics of survival and the impossibility of what needed to happen next. The numbers were simple and brutal. If they stayed here, everyone died. If they ran, the wounded died for certain. Unless someone refused to accept either option. She made her choice. While gunfire cracked overhead and the others hugged the ground like it was the only lover they'd ever have, Sloan left her cover. Crawling on her belly across open ground with bullets snapping inches above her head, dragging her aid bag behind her like an anchor made of everything she believed in. The gravel tore at her uniform and scraped skin from her elbows. Heat radiated from rock that had been baking since dawn. Somewhere above, someone was shooting at her, specifically had recognized movement and decided that was worth a few rounds of ammunition. But she kept moving, toward the sounds of pain and the smell of blood and the promise she'd made to herself the day her father died, that she'd carry on his work, that she'd refuse to accept loss as inevitable, that she'd drag people back from death's door even if it meant crawling through hell to reach them. The crawl across felt like miles, even though it was only 30 meters. Every inch measured against the possibility of dying before she reached the next wounded man. Every second a negotiation with physics and luck and whatever cosmic force decided who lived and who didn't. She made it, pressed herself flat next to Cross's body, her hands already moving before her mind had fully registered arrival. Reaching for the tourniquet on her vest fingers, finding it in the dark the way her father had taught her. Muscle memory older than conscious thought. Cross's face had gone gray with shock and blood loss. Eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from feeling your life leak out onto the ground and not being able to stop it. From understanding that the mathematics of survival were working against you and time was running out. The wound was high on his thigh. Arterial bleeding that meant minutes, not hours. Sloan didn't hesitate. She ripped the tourniquet from her kit and cinched it tight above the wound, positioning it exactly where it needed to be. Twisting the windlass with steady hands that had done this before and would do it again. Twisting until Cross screamed and the bleeding stopped. No time for comfort, no time for bedside manner. No time for anything except the brutal efficiency of keeping someone alive when their body had other plans. The bleeding stopped. Cross was still dying, but dying slower now. Slower meant time. Time meant possibility. She low-crawled toward Porter bullets, tracking her movement like they knew exactly what she was trying to do and wanted to stop her, striking sparks from the stones around her, close enough that she could smell the cordite, feel the heat, close enough to understand exactly how lucky she was and how quickly luck could change. Porter was conscious but fading, air bubbling through a hole in his chest with each breath, making sounds that belonged in nightmares, not daylight. Sucking chest wound. Sloan had seen them before, treated them before, knew exactly what needed to happen and how little time she had to make it happen. Her hands moved automatically, tearing open a chest seal and slapping it over the wound, creating an occlusive barrier that would let air out but not in, giving his lung a fighting chance to reinflate, giving him a fighting chance to keep breathing. Porter's eyes locked onto hers, desperate and afraid and holding onto consciousness by force of will alone. "Stay with me," she told him, voice calm despite the chaos around them, despite the bullets, despite everything. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me?" He nodded, barely. But it was enough. Hayes was 20 meters away, dragged behind a boulder by the blast that had shredded his arm. She reached him as another burst of gunfire chewed chunks from the rock above their heads, showering them both with stone chips and dust. "Thought you wouldn't last," Hayes whispered, his lips already pale with blood loss shock setting in the way it always did when the body realized it was in trouble and started shutting down to preserve what mattered most. Sloan packed his wound with gauze, wrapping it tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. The kind of judgment call that separated adequate from optimal, and optimal was what kept people alive. "Neither did I," she replied, her hands never stopping their work. "Guess we were both wrong." Around them, the remaining SEALs kept firing, but their movements had changed. Where before they'd been focused purely on the fight, now they kept glancing back at the medic, who was doing something they'd never seen before. refusing to accept that some men were beyond saving. The enemy fire intensified as they spotted movement in the riverbed. Shouts echoed from the ridgelines. Harsh voices coordinating an assault designed to finish what the ambush had started. Time was running out. But the three SEALs who should have been dead weren't dead anymore. They were stabilized, patched, given minutes they shouldn't have had. And the medic who'd crawled through hell to reach them wasn't done yet. Not even close. Sloan looked at the three men scattered across the gravel, too badly wounded to move on their own, too heavy to carry all at once, spread across 45 meters of open ground that was currently serving as a free fire zone for people who'd come here specifically to kill American operators. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Cross 220 pounds of muscle and gear femoral artery compromised, losing blood with every heartbeat. Maybe 4 minutes before hypovolemic shock made survival impossible. Porter, 225 pounds, sucking chest wound and lung, trying to collapse despite the seal sheet applied. Every breath a negotiation with physics and failing anatomy. Hazel, 195 pounds, radial artery laceration already showing signs of shock. Not immediately fatal, but the clock was running on him too. Three men. 3 different timelines to death. All of them measured in minutes, not hours. The textbook said to triage. Save who you could, except that some losses were necessary when resources were limited and time was short. Sloan Merrick had watched her father ignore that textbook for 20 years, had watched him drag impossible cases back from the edge through sheer refusal to quit, had learned that impossible just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet. She hooked her arms under Dalton Cross's shoulders and began pulling him toward the depression 50 meters away. The spot where a quirk of erosion had created a bowl in the ground deep enough to offer actual cover instead of the illusion of it. 50 meters might as well have been 50 miles. Cross outweighed her by 100 pounds before counting his gear. His body armor, ammunition, weapons, and equipment added another 40. She was asking her 118-pound frame to move 260 pounds of dead weight across broken terrain while people tried to kill her. The first 10 meters taught her exactly how impossible this was going to be. Her boots slipped on loose rock. Sweat made her grip on Cross's vest slick and unreliable. Her shoulder muscles started screaming within seconds, pushed past normal operating parameters into the realm where tissue damage was happening in real time. Bullets tracked her movement like they had a personal grudge, kicked up sprays of gravel that peppered her legs, sparked off rocks close enough to feel the heat, cracked overhead with sounds that meant someone was getting better at leading their target. She didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't allow herself to calculate the probability that the next bullet would find her instead of the stone around her. Because stopping meant Cross died here, and that wasn't acceptable. 20 meters covered. Her thighs were trembling now, quadriceps pushed into territory normally reserved for emergencies. Her breathing had gone ragged, oxygen debt accumulating faster than her cardiovascular system could manage. Keep moving. Next step, then the next. Don't think about the distance remaining. Think about the distance covered, 30 meters. Her vision started to blur at the edges. Combination of sweat running into her eyes and the first whispers of heat exhaustion catching up with her. The 112-degree air wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was becoming a weapon that worked from the inside out. 40 meters, almost there. Her lower back seized a muscle pushed past tolerance and deciding unilaterally that it was done. Pain shot up her spine in waves that made her gasp, made her want to stop, made her want to put Cross down just for a moment to catch her breath. She didn't. Her legs gave out at 45 meters, just folded beneath her like someone had cut the tendons. Cross's weight drove her to the ground, pinning her against rock that had been storing heat since dawn. For 3 seconds, she lay there, unable to move, unable to breathe, crushed under the weight of physics and biology, and a man who needed her to be stronger than she was. Then she adjusted her grip, braced her boots against the ground, and started pulling again. 5 more meters, inch by inch. While automatic weapons fire chewed the air overhead, and RPGs detonated close enough to make her ears ring. While her hands left bloody prints on Cross's vest and her vision narrowed to just the ground ahead and the promise of cover that was almost within reach. She made it, rolled Cross into the depression and immediately checked his vitals. Pulse thready but present. Tourniquet still tight, still doing its job. Level of consciousness, semi-responsive, which beat unconscious by a considerable margin. No time to rest, no time to acknowledge what she'd just done, no time for anything except the immediate tactical problem of 2 more wounded men and an enemy force that was getting closer. She started back toward Knox Porter immediately. Chief Garrett Wade watched from his inadequate cover as his medic crawled back into the open. moving toward Porter with the same methodical determination she'd shown moving toward Cross. Like bullets were weather rather than weapons. Like the probability of getting shot was just another variable to account for. "What the hell is she doing?" Ramirez shouted over the gunfire. One of the two SEALs, still combat effective, still laying down covering fire, still trying to keep the enemy honest. Wade didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Just provided suppressing fire and tried not to calculate the odds that his medic would make it back alive. Because those odds weren't good, and thinking about them wouldn't change them. Sloan reached Porter and dropped flat beside him. Reassessed his condition with hands that knew their job despite the trembling. Chest seal intact. Breathing labored but stable. Pulse elevated but strong enough to work with. She grabbed his vest with both hands, different grip. This time learning from the first drag, and began pulling. Porter tried to help. Pushed with his legs, tried to reduce the burden. But his body wasn't responding to commands anymore. Blood loss and shock had made coordination difficult and strength impossible. His efforts added maybe 10 pounds of assist. Better than nothing, but not enough to matter. Sloan pulled harder. The 55 meters back to the depression felt longer than the first drag. Her arms were already depleted, glycogen stores exhausted, running on whatever reserves the human body kept for situations that shouldn't be survivable. This qualified. 20 meters in her vision started tunneling. Sweat or exhaustion or early heat injury, didn't matter which. She blinked hard, trying to clear it, trying to maintain visual awareness of terrain and threats, and the shrinking distance to safety. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Can't stop." 30 meters. Her hands were bleeding now. Could feel it warm and slick against Porter's vest where friction had turned blisters into open wounds. The pain was present but distant, filed in the category of things she'd deal with later, if there was a later. 40 meters. Something in her lower back gave way completely. Not the same muscle that had seized before, a different one pushed past its structural limits and deciding it was done participating. Pain radiated through her core in waves that made breathing difficult. She kept pulling. Porter coughed blood onto her uniform. The wet bubbling sound said his lung was struggling again, pressure building despite the chest seal. She'd need to reassess the moment they reached cover. Might need to perform another needle decompression if the tension pneumothorax was recurring. But first she had to get him there. 50 meters. Her muscles were beyond tired now, operating on something that transcended willpower. Something harder and more stubborn. Something that lived in the space between giving up and watching people die. She made it to the depression and lowered Porter as gently as exhausted arms would allow. Immediately pulled her stethoscope, listened to his chest. Breath sounds diminished on the affected side. Pressure building again. No time to be gentle about this. "This is going to hurt," she told him, already pulling a fresh catheter from her kit. Porter nodded, too focused on breathing to waste energy on words. She located the landmark with bleeding fingers that still knew their anatomy. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The spot where a needle could relieve the pressure before it stopped his heart. Inserted the catheter with steady hands. The hiss of escaping air confirmed her assessment. Porter's breathing immediately eased, color returning to his face like someone had adjusted the lighting. "Better?" He managed a nod, this time with something approaching gratitude. Sloan allowed herself 5 seconds to check Cross's status. Still stable, still breathing, still fighting. The tourniquet was holding, but his foot was starting to look pale, early signs of ischemia from restricted blood flow. She loosened it a quarter turn, just enough to allow minimal perfusion without restarting the arterial bleeding. A judgment call, the kind that lived between textbook theory and field reality. Then she started back for Beckett Hayes. She was halfway there when the grenade landed. Hit the ground 3 meters to her left with a metallic sound that triggered every survival instinct she had. Time didn't slow, that was Hollywood nonsense. But her threat assessment accelerated. 2 seconds to recognize the danger. Maybe 1 second to react. Not enough time to run. Not enough time for cover. Barely enough time to turn her body so the blast wouldn't hit her face. The explosion lifted her like she weighed nothing, picked her up and threw her against rock that had no interest in cushioning impacts. The world went white, then red, then filled with ringing that drowned out everything, including her own thoughts. She lay there for a moment that could have been seconds or hours. Time had stopped being linear. Reality had stopped being reliable. Everything narrowed to the ringing in her ears and the pain radiating from everywhere at once. Then she felt the wet warmth spreading across her left shoulder. Blood. Her blood. Not arterial, she'd know that pattern. Venous bleeding from shrapnel that had torn through her deltoid muscle. The kind of wound that required immediate treatment under normal circumstances. These weren't normal circumstances. She pushed herself upright with her right arm. Her left arm hung useless, refusing commands. Nerve damage or muscle damage or both, making it unresponsive. The kind of injury that would end careers if it didn't heal right. The kind of injury that would make dragging Hayes impossible. She grabbed her own tourniquet and applied it one-handed to her left arm above the wound. Used her teeth where her left hand should have been helping. The pain was immediate and clarifying, sharp enough to cut through the fog, sharp enough to buy her a few more minutes of function. Hayes was 40 meters away, wedged behind a boulder that was providing inadequate cover from an enemy that was adapting. His eyes went wide when he saw her approach. "Doc, you're bleeding." "I'm fine." The lie came out steadier than she felt. "You're not." She dropped beside him and reassessed his wound one-handed. The pressure dressing was holding, but he'd lost blood. Too much blood. His skin had gone pale, lips slightly cyanotic. Early hypovolemic shock setting in the way it always did when the body realized it was in trouble. She pulled an IV kit from her bag, with her right hand using her teeth and her knees where her left hand couldn't help. Started a line in his arm with speed that came from muscle memory developed over too many emergencies. "Lactated ringers wide open," she told him, hanging the bag from a piece of his gear. "Your pressure's dropping. This'll help until we get you real help." "You need help too," Hayes whispered, staring at her shoulder, where blood was soaking through her uniform in a pattern impossible to hide. "I'm fine," she repeated, another lie. "Now we need to move. Can you help at all?" He tried. Managed to half crawl, half push, while she pulled with her one good arm. It was ugly and inefficient, and probably making both their injuries worse. But it was movement, and movement meant progress toward the depression where Cross and Porter waited. The 40 meters felt infinite. Every meter cost something: blood, energy, tissue, integrity. Every meter was a negotiation with a body that was giving out and a mind that refused to acknowledge it. She took hold of Hayes's tactical harness, different grip again, adapting to one-armed operation, and pulled. Her right arm was doing work it was never designed to do alone. Supporting weight meant for two arms, two shoulders, proper biomechanics. She could feel things straining, fibers tearing, tendons stressed past safe limits. Didn't matter, would deal with it later. If there was a later. 20 meters. Her right shoulder was screaming now, forced to compensate for the left side that had stopped working. The pain was becoming difficult to compartmentalize, bleeding through into conscious thought despite her best efforts to wall it off. Keep moving. Don't think about the pain. Think about the distance. 30 meters. Hayes was fading, the blood loss catching up with him despite the IV fluids. His efforts to help were becoming less coordinated, less effective. Turning him into dead weight, she had to move alone. She kept pulling. 35 meters. Something in her right shoulder gave way with a sensation that was less pain and more wrongness. A feeling of tissue separating that was meant to stay together. She felt it go and understood she'd just made her injury significantly worse. Kept pulling anyway. 40 meters. Made it. Rolled Hayes into the depression with Cross and Porter, all three wounded men in the same place now. All three alive when medical probability said they should be dead. All three depending on her to keep them that way. Sloane collapsed against the dirt wall of the depression and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to shake. 10 seconds to acknowledge that she'd just done something that violated the basic physics of human capability. 10 seconds to be 28 years old and terrified and hurting in ways that would take months to heal. 10 seconds to be human. Then she was back to being a medic. Cross tourniquet still effective, but his foot was getting paler. Distal ischemia from restricted blood flow. She loosened it another quarter turn, walking the line between preventing arterial bleeding and maintaining tissue perfusion. Porter breathing easier after the second needle decompression, but still compromised. He'd need a chest tube and surgical intervention to repair whatever the bullet had damaged internally. Soon. Hayes' blood pressure stabilizing with IV fluids, but still critically low. She adjusted the flow rate, checked his capillary refill, monitored his level of consciousness. All three critical. All three alive. All three her responsibility until someone else could take over. She checked her own injuries with clinical detachment. Left shoulder significant deltoid damage, probable nerve involvement, ongoing venous bleeding, controlled by tourniquet. Right shoulder overuse, injury, possible rotator cuff, tear, functional but compromised. Blood loss moderate and accelerating. Time until she became a casualty herself unknown, but not infinite. Filed it away. Would address it when the immediate crisis was over. Chief Wade's voice cut through the sound of ongoing gunfire, sharp with controlled urgency. "Command, this is Alpha 3, urgent surgical 1 walking wounded. Request immediate medevac." The radio crackled. For the first time in an hour, something other than static came through. Copy Alpha, QRF inbound, Itaikoe 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Sloan looked at the three men bleeding around her and understood that 12 minutes was both forever and no time at all. Forever if she could keep them stable. No time at all if something went wrong. She pulled fresh gauze from her kit, working one-handed, now her left arm completely useless, and began changing Porter's chest seal. The first one was saturated effectiveness compromised. She removed it carefully, applied a fresh seal, ensured proper occlusive coverage. Porter's eyes tracked her movements, conscious enough to be afraid enough to understand exactly how bad this was. Stay with me, she told him. 12 minutes. That's all we need. She moved across, rechecked his tourniquet. Still adequate, but the balance between too tight and not tight enough was getting harder to maintain. His foot was borderline ischemic. She made a micro-adjustment, loosening by millimeters rather than quarter turns. Cross managed a weak grin despite everything. Still think I won't last out here? Ask me in 12 minutes. She moved to Hayes, checked his IV rate, assessed his color. Better than before, but still not good. Pulse present, but thready. Blood pressure critically low, but no longer free-falling. Stable. Not good, but stable. She'd take stable. Around them, the firefight continued. Wade and the two remaining SEALs maintaining defensive positions, laying down suppressing fire, trying to keep the enemy at a distance. But the volume of incoming fire was increasing. The enemy adapting, flanking, getting closer. 9 minutes until the QRF. Sloane's vision was tunneling now. Blood loss from her shoulder catching up despite the tourniquet. She pulled a fresh dressing from her kit and pressed it against the wound with her right hand. Direct pressure, basic, effective, exhausting when you had to maintain it yourself. She held pressure and continued monitoring her patients with clinical efficiency that was becoming harder to maintain. Cross's foot was getting paler. She loosened the tourniquet another fraction. Better. Still not ideal, but better. Porter's breathing was deteriorating again. She listened to his chest diminish sounds on the affected side. The pneumothorax wasn't resolved, just managed. He needed surgery. Needed it soon. Hayes was drifting, consciousness slipping away as his brain prioritized vital functions over awareness. She grabbed his vest, gave him a shake. Hayes, stay with me. Don't you drift off. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding her face with effort. Tired. I know, but you need to stay awake. Just a few more minutes. Can you do that? He nodded, barely, but it was something. 7 minutes. Wade appeared at the edge of the depression, firing controlled bursts between movements. He glanced down at his medic and his wounded men, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, understanding, the look of someone witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. How are they? He asked between bursts. Alive, but they need surgery soon, all three of them. And you? I'm fine. Wade looked at the tourniquet on her arm, at the blood soaking her uniform, at the way she was favoring her right side because her left side had stopped functioning. You're a terrible liar, Doc. Good thing I'm a medic then. Something that might have been a laugh escaped Wade despite the circumstances, despite the bullets, despite everything. 5 minutes. The sound came as a whisper at first, distant but growing, the unmistakable rhythm of rotor blades beating air into submission, getting closer, getting real. The Black Hawk appeared over the ridge, flying low and aggressive. Door guns already tracking targets. The most beautiful thing Sloan had seen in her entire life. But the enemy had heard it too. Fire shifted skyward, tracers reaching up like deadly fireworks. The pilot banked hard, avoiding the worst of it, circling for another approach. Cannot land. The voice crackled over Wade's radio. Taking effective fire needs suppression. Wade's jaw tightened. 3 operators fighting against unknown numbers. No way to provide enough suppression to make the landing zone safe. Sloan made a decision. She grabbed smoke grenades from the packs of her wounded men. 4 canisters total. Not enough for proper concealment, but maybe enough for confusion. Doc, what are you doing? Wade's voice carried alarm, making it possible for that bird to land. She pulled herself out of the depression before he could stop her, moving on legs that barely worked, using her one functional arm to throw grenades in an arc between their position and the enemy ridgeline. Purple smoke erupted across the riverbed, then orange, then red, then green. A rainbow of chemical fog that obscured sight lines and made accurate fire difficult. Bullets searched for her through the smoke. Found rock. Found air. Found everything except her as she moved through the haze like a ghost with a death wish. Threw the last grenade and collapsed back into the depression. Her vision was graying at the edges now, Blood loss demanding payment for all the debts she'd accumulated. The tourniquet was helping, but not enough. She'd pushed too hard, asked too much, taken her body past the point where it could keep functioning without consequences. But the smoke was working. The helicopter came in fast and hard through the screen, landing in a cloud of dust and rotor wash. Crew chiefs jumping out before the skids fully touched down, ready for casualties. Sloan didn't wait for them to come to her. She grabbed Cross under the arms with her one good hand and started dragging him toward the bird. 30 meters. She'd already dragged him 50. What was 30 more? Everything. 30 more was everything. Her legs were shaking so badly they could barely support her own weight, much less Cross's. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel with the helicopter at the end. The ringing in her ears had become constant pressure. She kept moving. A crew chief met her halfway, took Cross from her without words, loaded him onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. She went back for Porter immediately. The crew chief tried to stop her. "Ma'am, you're wounded. Let us—" Porter has a recurring pneumothorax. He needs to be positioned on his right side during transport. Affected side up. Keep oxygen high flow. Do you understand? The crew chief recognized the tone of a medical professional who wouldn't be argued with, nodded. Sloan dragged Porter to the helicopter on autopilot, supervised his loading personally, made sure he was positioned correctly, made sure the crew understood the criticality of maintaining that position. Then went back for Hayes. She was operating on something beyond exhaustion now. Training and muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had surrendered. Hayes was lighter than the others, but felt heavier because she had nothing left to give. She gave it anyway. Got him to the helicopter. Got him loaded. Got all three of her wounded men on board where they'd receive care beyond her capability. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the helicopter's bulkhead. A crew chief pressed water into her good hand, shouted something she couldn't hear over engines and rotors and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Wade appeared, helped her onto the helicopter despite her protests that she could walk, that she was fine, that she didn't need help. All lies, but necessary ones. The kind you told when admitting weakness meant giving up. The Black Hawk lifted off, banking away from the kill zone, away from the bullets and explosions in the place where three men should have died but hadn't. Sloan looked at them now. Cross's color was better. IV fluids helping. He'd need surgery, but he'd survive to see it. Porter breathing easier in the oxygen-rich environment. Still critical, but no longer actively dying. Hayes alert enough to track movement, to understand he was going to make it. They were going to live, all three of them. The mission was complete. The crew chief leaned close, had to shout over the noise. "What you did back there, that was something else." Sloan shook her head, too exhausted for conversation. Too focused on maintaining consciousness to accept praise she didn't think she'd earned. Wade sat across from her, pulled something from his vest, a seal trident patch worn soft with age and service and meaning. He pressed it into her good hand, leaned close enough to be heard. "That's yours now. You earned it." She looked at the patch, then at him. For the first time since the ambush started, her professional calm cracked. Just slightly. Not with pride or satisfaction, but with quiet recognition of something irreversible. She'd crossed a line today that couldn't be uncrossed. Had proven something that would change how people saw her. How she saw herself. The helicopter banked toward base carrying its cargo of wounded warriors and one medic who'd refused to accept that some battles couldn't be won. Sloan's vision was going dark. Blood loss finally demanding payment. She fought it, tried to stay conscious, tried to keep monitoring because that was her job, and jobs didn't end until someone else took over. But biology had other plans. The last thing she saw was Wade's hand on her good shoulder. Steady, grounding. The last thing she heard was the crew chief's urgent voice. "She's crashing. Get trauma team ready. We've got 4 critical, not 3. Then darkness took her, just the sound of rotors and the knowledge that she'd done what needed doing. That 3 men would see tomorrow because she'd refused to accept any other outcome. That was enough. Sloan woke to white ceiling, white walls, white sheets pulled up to her chest. The antiseptic smell of a hospital that was trying very hard to convince you that death didn't happen here. That everything was clean and controlled and manageable. Her left shoulder was wrapped in enough bandages to suggest the doctors had taken the injury seriously. Pain medication was doing its job, keeping the worst of it at bay, while allowing enough through to remind her that she still had a body, and that body had opinions about recent events. Those opinions were mostly negative. A nurse noticed her eyes open. Young, competent, the kind of professional calm that came from dealing with wounded warriors on a regular basis. "Welcome back, Petty Officer Merrick. You've been out for 18 hours. Sloan's throat was dry. Speaking took effort. My patients, Cross, Porter, Hayes, where are they? The nurse smiled, not the fake professional smile that preceded bad news. A real one. All three are in post-op recovery, stable. They're going to be fine. Sloane closed her eyes, let that information settle into the parts of her brain that had been screaming worst-case scenarios since the moment the helicopter lifted off. They were alive, all three of them. Zero acceptable casualties. You had us worried, the nurse continued checking the monitors. Emergency surgery to repair your deltoid muscle. Significant nerve damage, blood transfusion. You lost almost 2 pints before we got you stabilized. How bad is the nerve damage? The nurse hesitated, the kind of hesitation that preceded information you didn't want to hear but needed to. The surgeon will discuss it with you, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility of permanent limited mobility in your left shoulder. Maybe 60 to 70% function if the physical therapy goes well. 60 to 70%. Enough to live a normal life, not enough for full duty, not enough to go back to the field and do the job she trained for. The kind of injury that ended careers. Sloane absorbed this information with the same clinical detachment she brought to everything else. Filed it away in the category of things that couldn't be changed and therefore weren't worth emotional energy. She'd made her choice in that riverbed, would make it again. Some things were worth the cost. When can I see them, she asked. The surgeon wants to examine you first. Then we'll see about visits. The surgeon arrived an hour later. Commander Patricia Walsh, 50-something, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. She examined Sloane's shoulder with practiced hands, checking range of motion, nerve response, pain levels. You tore your deltoid completely off the bone, Walsh said without preamble. Shrapnel severed multiple nerve bundles. We reattached what we could, but full recovery is unlikely. You'll regain some function with therapy. How much depends on how hard you work and how lucky you are. Will I be able to deploy? Walsh's expression answered before her words did. Medical Review Board will make the final determination. But realistically, you're looking at honorable medical discharge or reassignment to non-deployable duties. Sloane nodded, had expected this. The mathematics of nerve damage and military requirements didn't leave much room for optimism. There is another option, Walsh continued. Fort Sam Houston needs instructors for their advanced combat medicine program. Your record speaks for itself. What you did in that riverbed, that's the kind of thing we need to be teaching. Teaching, passing on knowledge instead of using it directly. Training the next generation instead of being on the ground yourself. It wasn't what she'd planned, wasn't what she'd wanted, but wanting and getting were two different things. She'd learned that early. I'll consider it, Sloane said. You should also know, Walsh added, that you're being recommended for the Navy Cross. Chief Wade submitted the paperwork. His entire team co-signed it. The Navy Cross, the highest decoration below the Medal of Honor. The kind of recognition that careers were built on. Sloane felt nothing about it. No pride, no satisfaction. Just a distant acknowledgement that paperwork would be filed and decisions would be made, and none of it would change what had happened in that valley. I just did my job, she said quietly. Walsh studied her for a long moment, then nodded with something that might have been understanding. The best ones always say that. They let her see Cross, Porter, and Hayes that afternoon. Walking hurt. Everything hurt. But she made it to their rooms under her own power because accepting help felt like admitting defeat. Cross was first. His room smelled of disinfectant and the particular staleness that hospitals develop despite their best efforts. He was awake, leg elevated, and wrapped in enough bandages to suggest the surgeons had taken their time. Doc. His voice was hoarse but strong. They told me you dragged me 58 meters while people were shooting at you. 60 actually, but who's counting? I'm 225 pounds. I noticed. Cross shook his head in something that might have been disbelief or might have been awe, hard to tell which. I gave you shit, said you wouldn't last, said you'd slow us down. You did. I was wrong, I'm sorry. Sloane sat in the chair beside his bed. Her shoulder protested. She ignored it. You were doing your job, making sure your team was solid. Nothing to apologize for. Still, what you did that wasn't normal. That wasn't what medics do. It's exactly what medics do. You just hadn't seen it yet. They sat in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that existed between people who'd shared something that couldn't quite be put into words. My leg, Cross finally asked. The question he'd been avoiding. The one that mattered most. They saved it. Full recovery expected in 6 to 8 months. You'll walk with a slight limp when you're tired, but you'll walk. Cross closed his eyes, relief written across his face in lines too deep for words. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just get better. Porter was in the ICU. Chest tube draining, fluid oxygen mask covering half his face, monitors, beeping in rhythms that Sloan recognized as stable but critical. His wife was there, holding his hand with a kind of grip that suggested she'd been afraid to let go since arriving. Small, dark-haired eyes red from crying. She looked up when Sloan entered. Recognition flickered across her face. You're the medic, the one who saved him. I'm Sloan Merrick, yes. Porter's wife stood, crossed the small room in 3 steps, pulled Sloan into a hug that made her injured shoulder scream. Sloan endured it. Some pain was worth it. Thank you. The words came out choked. They said he wouldn't have made it. They said the chest wound should have killed him. They said you did something impossible. I did what needed doing. Emma. Porter's voice was weak but clear. Her name is Emma. She's 3. She asks about Daddy every night. He gestured to the bedside table where a photo stood. Little girl with dark curls and Porter's eyes holding a stuffed bear nearly as big as she was. She gets to keep asking, Sloan said. That's what matters. Porter's eyes were wet. I get to go home because of you. I get to read her bedtime stories. I get to teach her to ride a bike. I get to be there. Then be there, make it count. Hayes was in better shape than the others. Arm in a complex brace that suggested the surgeons had been thorough. Color back in his face. Alert enough to be bored, which was always a good sign. Doc. He tried to sit up straighter when she entered, winced, settled for a nod instead. Hayes. They told me you were wounded, that you kept working anyway. Had to. You needed treatment. I saw you get hit by that grenade, saw you get back up, saw you drag me with one arm while bleeding out. Sloan said nothing. Let him process it in his own time. I thought you wouldn't last, Hayes said quietly. Thought you were too small, too quiet, too soft for this kind of work. You weren't the only one. I was wrong, we all were. You're the toughest person I've ever met, and I've met a lot of people claiming to be tough. Tough is just stubborn with better PR. Hayes laughed, then winced because laughing hurt. They're saying you're getting the Navy Cross. They're saying a lot of things. You deserve it. You deserve more than that. Sloan stood. Her shoulder was screaming now, the pain medication wearing off. Time to get back to her own room before she fell down. Just get better, Hayes. That's all I need. Chief Garrett Wade found her the next day. Brought coffee that was terrible and company that wasn't. They sat in the hospital courtyard where the California sun was doing its best to pretend everything was normal. That men didn't bleed out in deserts. That medics didn't drag the wounded through hell. That the world was safe and predictable. 3 out of 3, Wade said. 100% survival rate on critical casualties under hostile fire. You know what the average is, 30%, maybe 40 if the medic is exceptional and the circumstances allow. Statistics don't mean much when you're the one bleeding. No, but they mean something to the people writing doctrine, to the people training the next generation, to the people trying to figure out how to keep more warriors alive. Sloan sipped her coffee. It was as bad as expected. She drank it anyway. Walsh told you about the teaching position, Wade asked. She mentioned it. You should take it. What you did out there that needs to be studied, taught, replicated. I just did what my father taught me. Refuse to accept loss. Fight for every life. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then, Elena Rodriguez, you remind me of her. Your previous medic. She died because I ordered her to stay back. Thought I was protecting her. She disobeyed. Saved my life. Died doing it. He pulled out his wallet, showed Sloan a photo. Young woman in uniform smiling at the camera like she knew a joke the rest of the world hadn't heard yet. I blamed myself. Thought if I'd let her do her job, she might have survived. Thought if I'd made different choices, she'd still be here. You don't know that. No, I don't. But I learned something. Trying to keep medics safe by keeping them away from the fight that gets more people killed, including the medics. He put the photo away, looked at Sloan with eyes that had seen too much. You taught me that keeping people safe means letting them do their jobs, even when it's terrifying, even when you want to protect them, especially then. I'm not her, Sloan said quietly. No, you're not. You're you, and that's exactly what we needed. The Navy Cross ceremony happened 3 weeks later. Sloan stood in dress uniform, left arm in a sling, while a rear admiral she'd never met read citation text that made what she'd done sound heroic rather than desperate. For extraordinary heroism while serving as combat medic with SEAL Team 7 during operations in restricted training zone. Petty Officer Merrick repeatedly exposed herself to intense hostile fire to reach three critically wounded teammates. Despite sustaining severe injuries, she provided life-saving medical treatment and single-handedly evacuated all three casualties to safety. Her actions were directly responsible for the survival of three Navy SEALs who would otherwise have been killed in action. The medal was heavy, heavier than it should be, like it carried the weight of all those moments in the riverbed, all those decisions that had seemed impossible at the time. Cross Porter and Hayes were there, all three in uniform, all three alive because she'd refused to accept any other outcome. They saluted her. She saluted back, the gesture feeling both too formal and exactly right. After the ceremony, Wade presented her with the SEAL Trident patch he'd given her in the helicopter, but this time it was framed, matted, official. "Welcome to the Brotherhood," he said. "You earned this in blood, yours and theirs. That's the only way it counts." Sloan looked at the trident, at the symbol of a community she'd never expected to be part of. A community that had started by doubting her and ended by accepting her. "I'm just a medic," she said. "Nope, Wade replied. "You're our medic. There's a difference." 6 months later, Sloan stood in front of a classroom at Fort Sam Houston. 18 students sat in rows before her, a mix of Army, Navy, and Air Force. Mix of male and female. All of them young enough to still think they were immortal. Old enough to know better. She'd spent the last 6 months in physical therapy, rebuilding her shoulder one painful repetition at a time, relearning how to use an arm that didn't quite work the way it used to, coming to terms with the fact that her career as a field medic was over and her career as an instructor had begun. Some days that felt like defeat. Other days it felt like evolution. Today it felt like purpose. "Your job," she told the class, "is zero acceptable casualties, not minimizing losses, not saving who you can. Zero." A hand went up. Young Sergeant Army's skeptical expression. "Ma'am, the textbook says we have to triage, save the most salvageable, except that we can't save everyone." "The textbook," Sloan replied, "was written by people who never had to choose between following doctrine and watching people die. Triage is a tool, not a philosophy. Your philosophy should be that everyone lives, period." She clicked to the next slide. Photos from the riverbed. 3 wounded SEALs. Distances measured. Timeline reconstructed. 6 months ago, I was assigned to a SEAL team for what should have been a routine training exercise. It became something else. 3 men went down with injuries that were supposed to be fatal. Femoral artery hemorrhage, tension pneumothorax, severe arterial laceration. She pointed to Cross in the photo. 225 pounds. I weigh 118. I dragged him 60 meters under fire, alone. Pointed to Porter. Sucking chest wound, needed immediate needle decompression or his heart would have stopped in minutes. I performed it while bullets were hitting the rocks around us. Pointed to Hayes. Severe blood loss, going into shock. I established IV access and fluid resuscitation in an active combat zone. She looked at her students, saw the doubt, saw the skepticism, saw the same expression Cross had worn when she'd first arrived at Fort Irwin. Good. Doubt was the beginning of learning. All 3 survived. All 3 made full recovery. All 3 returned to duty. Not because I'm special, because I refused to accept that fatal meant dead, because I was willing to do what seemed impossible until it became merely difficult. Another hand, female Corporal Navy. How do you make those decisions? How do you choose who to treat first when they're all critical? You don't choose. You treat whoever you can reach first, then the next, then the next. You keep moving until everyone is stable or you physically can't move anymore. But what if you can't reach them all? Sloan was quiet for a moment, remembering the feel of gravel under her elbows, the sound of bullets overhead, the weight of men who outweighed her by 100 pounds. Then you try anyway, because trying and failing means you did everything possible. Not trying means you've accepted defeat before the fight even started, and that's not acceptable. She clicked to the next slide, training curriculum. Skills breakdown, timeline for the 12-week course. You're going to learn conventional trauma medicine. Then you're going to learn how to perform it while people are trying to kill you, how to make decisions under fire, how to drag casualties who outweigh you, how to keep working when you're injured yourself. She paused, made eye contact with each student. Some of you won't make it through this course, not because you're weak, because you're not willing to do what's necessary. And that's fine. Better to find out here than in a riverbed in the middle of nowhere while your teammates are bleeding out. After class, one of the students approached. Young specialist, couldn't be more than 22. Nervous in the way people got when they were about to ask something important. Ma'am, is it true you were wounded during that rescue that you kept working anyway? Sloan rolled her left shoulder. The movement still hurt. Probably always would. Shrapnel tore through my deltoid, severed nerve bundles. I applied a tourniquet to my own arm and continued treating casualties. Why, because they needed me, because I was the only medic there, because stopping meant watching them die. Take your pick. The specialist nodded slowly. Processing. I want to be like that. I want to be the kind of medic who doesn't quit. Then don't quit. It's that simple and that hard. The student left. Sloan gathered her materials. Another class in 2 hours. Then practical exercises. Then after-action reviews of real combat scenarios. The work never stopped. The need never diminished. There would always be more warriors who needed medics who refused to quit. And she would teach them. Would pass on what her father had taught her. What that riverbed had taught her. What Cross and Porter and Hayes had taught her by surviving. That zero acceptable casualties wasn't naive. It was necessary. Her phone buzzed. Text from Wade. Heard you started teaching. How's it going? She typed back. They're skeptical. Good. So were we. Look how that turned out. Sloan smiled, put the phone away, looked at the training schedule for the next 6 months. 18 students now. Another class starting next month. Then another, multiplying her impact, teaching others to do what she'd done, creating a ripple effect that would spread far beyond anything she could accomplish alone. The phrase had started small, something Wade said in a debriefing, something the other SEALs picked up, something that spread through the medical community like a virus looking for hosts. Drag them out alive. Not some of them. Not the most salvageable. All of them. It became unofficial motto, became rallying cry, became the standard against which combat medics measured themselves. Within 6 months, 15 military bases had adopted elements of Sloan's training methodology. The integrated trauma response curriculum that focused on refusing to accept loss, on doing the impossible until it became routine. I was paying attention. Commissioning studies, looking at survival rates from units that had adopted the training versus units that hadn't. The numbers were promising. Survival rates up 12%. Time to definitive care down by an average of 8 minutes. Medics reporting higher confidence in their ability to manage mass casualty situations. Numbers that represented lives. People who would come home instead of coming home in boxes. Sloan tried not to think about it in those terms. Tried to focus on the students in front of her rather than the abstract statistical impacts of her work. But sometimes late at night when the phantom pain in her shoulder kept her awake, she'd think about all the medics she was training, all the casualties they'd treat over their careers. All the families that would stay whole because someone refused to accept that fatal meant dead. The math was staggering, humbling, terrifying. Her father would have understood. Sergeant First Class Nathan Merrick had spent 20 years teaching young medics to refuse defeat, to fight for every life like it was their own. He died doing exactly that, treating casualties under fire, refusing to leave anyone behind. She'd inherited that stubbornness, that refusal to accept loss, that commitment to the impossible. And now she was passing it on. On a Saturday in October, Sloan drove to the military cemetery where her father was buried. She'd been avoiding it, making excuses about being too busy, too tired, too focused on recovery. Truth was, she hadn't known what to say. His grave was simple, standard military marker, name, rank, dates, nothing that captured who he'd been or what he'd meant to the people he'd saved. She sat on the grass beside the headstone, shoulder aching from the long drive, heart aching from everything else. I made it through, Dad, like you taught me. 3 men alive because I refused to quit. The cemetery was quiet, just wind through the trees and distant traffic. I can't deploy anymore, shoulders too damaged. But I'm teaching now, passing on what you taught me, trying to multiply the impact. She traced the letters of his name on the stone. They're calling it drag them out alive. Your philosophy, your refusal to accept loss. It's spreading. 15 bases, hundreds of students. It's becoming bigger than both of us. A bird landed nearby, watched her with black eyes that revealed nothing. I hope you're proud. I hope wherever you are, you know that your work didn't end with you, that it's continuing, growing, saving lives you'll never know about. She placed her Navy Cross at the base of the headstone. The medal felt right there, belonged with him more than it belonged with her. 0 acceptable casualties, Dad, just like you taught me. She sat there for a long time until the sun started to set and the cemetery gates would close soon, until the ache in her shoulder demanded she move. Before leaving, she pulled out her phone, called her mother for the first time in months. Dr. Claire Merrick answered on the second ring. ER physician, tough as nails voice, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who just finished a 12-hour shift. Sloan, everything okay? I'm at Dad's grave. Silence on the other end. Then how are you? I'm teaching now. Fort Sam Houston, combat medicine, passing on what he taught me. I heard about what you did. Wade called me, told me everything, told me you saved 3 men, nearly died doing it. I made the right choice, Mom. Another silence, longer this time. When Claire spoke again, her voice was thick with emotions she rarely showed. Your father would be so proud of you. I'm proud of you, even though it terrifies me, even though I wish you'd chosen something safer. Safe doesn't save lives. No, it doesn't, but Sloan, promise me you'll take care of yourself. Promise me you'll let others help carry the weight sometimes. I promise to try. That's all I can ask. They talked for another 20 minutes. About teaching, about recovery, about Claire's work at the hospital, about everything and nothing. When they hung up, Sloan felt lighter. Like she'd been carrying weight she didn't know was there until it was gone. She drove back to base as the sun set over California, thinking about the students she'd teach on Monday, about the lives they'd save over their careers, about the ripple effects that would spread far beyond anything she could measure. Her phone buzzed. Text from Wade. Team 7 has a mission next month, requesting you as medical advisor for pre-deployment training. You and he, Sloan smiled, typed back without hesitation. When do we start? 3 days later, she was back at Fort Irwin. Different role now, not the doubted newcomer, but the proven expert. Not the one being tested, but the one doing the teaching. Wade's team had grown, new faces mixed with familiar ones. Cross was there, slight limp, but otherwise fully recovered. Hayes had made the transition to shooting left-handed look easy. Porter had photos of Emma on his phone that he showed anyone who'd stand still long enough. They gathered in the briefing room. 12 SEALs and 1 instructor who weighed less than most of their rucks. Gentlemen, Wade began, this is Petty Officer Sloan Merrick. Some of you know her. Some of you know of her. All of you are going to learn from her. He gestured to Sloan. She stood, shoulder still aching but functional, left arm at maybe 70%, but that was enough. 0 acceptable casualties, she said. That's the standard, not the goal, the standard. Anything less is failure. A new SEAL raised his hand, young, confident, skeptical in the way they all were before reality taught them otherwise. Ma'am, what if the casualty is already dead? What if there's nothing we can do? Sloan looked at him, saw herself 6 months ago, saw every medic who'd ever faced that question. Then you tried everything possible and failed, which is different from not trying at all. The first one you can live with. The second one you can't. Cross spoke up. She dragged my 225-pound ass 60 meters while bleeding out from her own wound. If she says 0 acceptable casualties is possible, believe her. Porter nodded. She saved my life when my lung was collapsing. Performed needle decompression under fire. Never hesitated. Hayes added, she worked with 1 arm after shrapnel tore through her shoulder. Refused to quit until all 3 of us were on that helicopter. The new SEAL looked at them, looked at Sloan, understanding beginning to dawn that this wasn't theory. This was proven methodology taught by someone who'd lived it. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. The training lasted 2 weeks. Sloan pushed them harder than they expected, made them practice dragging casualties who outweighed them, made them perform procedures while running, made them make decisions under stress that simulated combat. She didn't go easy, didn't accept excuses, didn't let them quit when it got hard, because the alternative was men bleeding out in riverbeds while their medics decided saving everyone was impossible. On the final day, Wade pulled her aside. You've changed the culture, he said, not just in my team, across the community. People are talking about you, about what you did, about what you're teaching. I'm just passing on what my father taught me. Your father taught you, but you proved it. There's a difference. He handed her a folder. Inside was a formal request from Naval Special Warfare Command. They wanted her to develop doctrine, wanted her methodology standardized across all SEAL teams, wanted her to make what she'd done in that riverbed into something repeatable, teachable, standard. This is bigger than training 1 team, Wade said. This is changing how we prepare medics for combat, how we think about casualty care, how we refuse to accept preventable deaths. Sloan looked at the request, at the signature of a rear admiral she'd never met, at the opportunity to multiply her impact beyond anything she'd imagined. When do they need an answer? Whenever you're ready. She thought about Cross Porter and Hayes, about the students she was teaching, about the medics who would train under the curriculum she'd developed, about the lives that would be saved by people she'd never meet in places she'd never go, about her father's legacy continuing through her, growing beyond both of them. I'm ready now. I thought you might be. 6 months after that day in the riverbed, Sloane Merrick stood at a podium in front of 200 combat medics, teaching them what she'd learned, passing on what her father had taught her, refusing to accept that some deaths were inevitable. She told them about Cross, about Porter, about Hayes, about the impossible drag through gunfire, about the decision to save everyone instead of choosing who to let die, about working with one arm while her other arm hung useless and bleeding, about refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. Some heal, she concluded. Some fight. The best do both when called. Your job is to be the best, to refuse to accept loss, to drag them out alive no matter what it costs. She paused, looked at the faces staring back at her. Young, idealistic, about to learn that idealism backed by skill and stubbornness could change the world. Zero acceptable casualties. That's not naive. That's not impossible. That's your job. Now go do it. The room erupted in applause, but Sloane barely heard it. She was already thinking about the next class. The next group of medics who needed to learn that impossible was just another word for hard. That night, she got a message from Porter. Photo of him reading to Emma, both of them smiling. Caption read, "Because of you, thank you." Then Cross. Video of him running, no limp visible. Caption, "Back to full duty, you were right about everything." Then Hayes. Photo from a range, target with tight grouping, all left-handed. Caption, "Better than I was before. Still learning from you." Sloane saved the messages, would look at them on days when the teaching felt endless and the impact felt abstract. When she needed reminding that the work mattered, that lives were being saved, that her father's legacy was continuing. She stood at her window, looking out at Fort Sam Houston, where hundreds of medics were learning to refuse defeat, learning that zero acceptable casualties wasn't a slogan. It was a commitment. Her shoulder ached. Always would. A permanent reminder of the day she'd proven that one person refusing to quit could change everything. Tomorrow she'd teach another class. Would push students harder than they thought possible. Would demand they reach for impossible until it became routine. Would continue her father's work. Would multiply the impact. Would save lives she'd never know about through the medics she trained. The phone buzzed one more time. Wade. Teams deploying in 3 weeks. New medic trained under your curriculum. Wanted you to know. She typed back, "Drag them out alive." Always. Sloane closed her eyes, saw that riverbed again, felt the weight of Cross in her arms, heard Porter's labored breathing, saw Hayes's pale face, saw all three of them alive. That was the point. That was always the point. Some people talked about making a difference. She dragged the difference out of a kill zone one impossible meter at a time, and now she was teaching others to do the same. Zero acceptable casualties. Drag them out alive, always.